W.H.C. Friend says the Decian persecution was the gravest setback the church ever suffered. So if you look at Robert Louis Wilken, again, he says persecution had divided the community between those who had stood firm and those who had, in Cyprian's words, he was the Bishop of Carthage, broken their oath to Christ by offering sacrifice. Idolatry, venerating false gods, transgressed Christianity's most fundamental belief in God. Dubbed the lapsed because they had sacrificed or obtained certificates by whatever means. By church law, they were excluded from participation in the Eucharist. But the other group was made up of those who had courageously confessed their faith, been imprisoned, flogged, twisted on the rack, starved in dark, damp dungeons, and in some cases, of course, executed. Their steadfastness not only brought honor, it covered on them unique spiritual prerogatives. And there was the rub. So says Wilken, because you had these two groups, Christianity was significantly divided about what to do about them. Those who had stood firm and were killed were almost over-venerated. And for others, a whole system of how do you bring people back to faith who had compromised themselves, how do you bring them back to the church? And that, of course, becomes the whole basis for the medieval system of penance. The penance system, which is going to dominate the church for over 1,000 years, comes from finding a way to make sure that those who had lapsed in a time of persecution, how you bring them back into fellowship in the church. So I argue that this actually weakens the church itself, and this is probably the permanent damage of this persecution. Numerically speaking, it doesn't kill Christianity that much. There is evidence that there were about, at the end of the first century, maybe 10,000 Christians. That's not many, because the population of the empire was about 60 million at the time. By about the year 200, the number of Christians is 200,000, we think. By the year 250, however, when Decius is launching this campaign, the number has probably risen to more than 1 million, about 2% of the population. And by the time we get to the beginning of the 3rd century, we think the number is maybe up at around 1 million. So maybe 10% of the population. Rodney Stark argues that it's 6 million. So you could probably argue that this persecution maybe even increased growth. And I think there's something to that. But the damage was done in the creation of permanent disunity. Again, W.H.C. Friend puts it this way, he said, the ultimate legacy of these persecutions was the lasting division of Christendom into its eastern and western parts. And this is significantly to do with the attitude to the emperor as Christianity became a tolerated and promoted religion in the 300s. In the East, the emperor was accepted as the kind of earthly manifestation of divine reason. And this would result, quite frankly, in the church getting far too close to the state and resulting in perhaps the church becoming an instrument of persecution of those who disagreed with it. And you can trace this right up to the present with, for example, Russia, with the Russian Orthodox Church leveraging a very cozy relationship with Vladimir Putin to the intense disadvantage of the Protestants. In the West, the relationship with the state was never so cozy, especially given St. Augustine's great classic, The City of God, which took quite a negative view of the state's existence. So that's a great consequence of this persecution, this huge division into East and West. The second big result that we've already alluded to is that a penance system, in order to deal with those who had backslidden or apostatized, came into being. And this system increased over time, and it became ever more elaborate, an elaborate scheme of how to get back into the good graces of God. And it would dominate Christianity for over 1,000 years. In fact, it will be a taper that burns and will flare up to cause the Reformation itself, because it's against this and the selling of so-called indulgences, which is central to the penance system, that gets Martin Luther so concerned, and the Reformation gets underway. You see the impact that it has even long after. So the third result of this great global persecution is not actually that negative, but it does have massive and permanent consequences, in that it led to the birth of the monasteries. The persecutions, of course, had created an age of martyrs. There were still a lot of martyrs, and they were venerated as ideal saints. But then, of course, when Constantine takes power, he makes Christianity tolerated. So it's not possible to be a martyr anymore. So the equivalent of being a martyr is to go into the desert and become a monk. Sometimes that was not good, because these monks went off and really were only concerned about their own individual salvation. But over time, it was very important that the monasteries also, especially after a great individual called Basil, he made the monasteries homes for mission, and they reached out to the culture. And the monastery is actually one of the great unsung heroes of resisting persecution, as we'll see in later global persecutions. So that's the third great result. It results in an explosion of monks and the creation of the monasteries. And of course, there's a final consequence of this Roman persecution, and that is that the persecutor still uses what we might call the Decius option. We definitely need to see this method around today. In a sense, the persecutor says, how do we neutralize an underground church? Because we don't know where they are, we can't go in and kill them. So what they do is create a variation of the tactic of creating apostates, not martyrs, releasing something into the underground group that divides it. And that's very alive around the world today.